Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you very much for bearing the cold and joining us tonight for a really good event we've got on the war on culture. Tonight it's going to be moderated by Bobby Duffy. He's the director of the Policy Institute at KCL. So I'll pass you over to Bobby to introduce the rest of the panel. Cheers.
Great, thank you so much, Grant, and thank you everyone for coming. We do have a great panel to talk about this issue today. I'm Bobby Duffy, I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's and Professor of Public Policy, and we've done a big study on culture wars in the UK in comparison with the US, and trying to put it all into a kind of international context with our good partners Ipsos Mori at that Gideon is from. So Gideon will be, after I'll do a little tiny bit of intro, and Gideon will give you some of the data and findings from that big study as a bit of context. And then we've got Zoe Strimpel, who is a columnist at the Sunday Telegraph and has written in and around these types of issues, as well as being academic historian. Oh, I'm lost again. Can you hear me? All right. Oh, it's back. Yes, good. Looking around at all these types of issues, all related types of issues. And then we have Emilio Casalicchio, who is political correspondent at Politico, and you write the playbook.
I did. I don't anymore. I managed to junk it.
You junked that.
Yeah,
yes,
I managed to get off of doing it.
More time to think about culture wars and issues like that. So a brilliant lineup. And we'll talk for between the panel for the next 50 minutes, an hour, that sort of stuff. And there's plenty of time for questions. And we do have a great online audience, I think, today, Grant. So we'll be taking questions from them as well as we go through. So if you just want to just put a little tiny bit of context on this from the work that we did. So it was called Culture Wars in the UK. And basically, the reason that we started looking at this is we did a report in 2019 that was called Divided Britain. And at the end of that report, we saw that when we got to the end and the conclusions of that report, and we started presenting it at party conferences and things, we did kind of notice that the language of culture wars was starting to be imported into the UK. Just the actual term culture wars have been more and more imported into the UK. So we did a media content analysis, just counting the times that culture wars has been used as a term over time, and splitting it between articles that are talking about the UK and articles that are talking about other countries, which tends to be the US. So if you look at this chart, that's the purple line is non-UK articles. You can see it kind of peaks around presidential election years. Those little bumps in the purple line are around presidential election years. You can see it going up. It went up quite a lot in 2020, not surprisingly with President Trump in place. But you can see it's absolutely dwarfed by the increase in the light blue line, which is articles about culture wars in the UK. So this is talking about how we have, or discussing whether we have culture wars in the UK. In fact, we went from having 21 articles about culture wars in the UK in 2015 to 534 articles in mainstream UK newspapers about culture wars in the UK by 2020. So it's incredible surge in the use of the term. Do you want to click? So it's just looking at, a really important thing to say about this is it's just looking at the term culture wars. It's not looking at all the issues that go into it. It doesn't cover all the issues and stories, and people talk about it in different sorts of ways. The research that we're doing right now is looking at the use of the term woke, because that's kind of, the argument has moved on to woke and anti-woke and all those types of things. So we're looking at that content now. And next one, Grant, just next click. Really important thing to say about this is this kind of media and political narrative around culture wars is we talked to a lot of the US academics about how culture wars evolved in the US, and their point is that it can't just be a top-down phenomenon in terms of stoking up this sense of cultural division. There has to be something authentic within the population, as in concern about culture change, or else it won't take with people. You can't just create these things out of nothing. But how the media and politicians talk about the issues is shown to be important in the US in particular. That there is a lot of academic work that shows that you can set a tone top down in terms of how politics talk, politicians talk and act, and how the media talks and acts about culture wars. So it's a bit of a systemic issue. where you've got cultural concern about concern about cultural change coming up, but you've also got this top down where you can set a tone and a narrative that becomes quite divisive, and that's why it's really important. I've only got one more slide, which is the next one. You just click through all these actually, Grant, to get to the, I'll just go through it quick. And another really important thing, we've been having lots of discussions about culture wars with academics and politicians. And one thing to really bear in mind is that a culture war signals much more than disagreement about culture change. That's not what we're talking about here. Disagreement about the pace or nature of culture change is natural in societies. It's inevitable in societies, and actually it's healthy for societies. We need to have that sense of friction and disagreement between people with different views, generation on generation, or between different social groups, or else society becomes quite stagnant if you don't have that. That's not what culture wars are in terms of the academic work in the US. What people like James Davison Hunter would say, he wrote the book in 1991 called Culture Wars, that kind of is credited with really popularizing the term. He talks about culture wars as a sense of conflict between two irreconcilable views of what is fundamentally right and wrong about the world we live in. So it becomes utterly to do with your identity, whether you're on one side or the other. And then that's been developed over the years by different academics. Lily Mason, we've actually got an event tomorrow at King's with Lily coming to talk about her work. What she added to this, and others added to this, is that lots of different issues start to get folded into these identities. It starts off with one or two issues, maybe Brexit in the UK, could be abortion in the US, but it gets more and more issues get rolled into it. And she says, and others say, that these mega identities get formed. And when you've got lots of things in these mega identities, we start to think of out-group partisans as quite different from us. If there's more and more that you as part of your identity and more that is part of this other group's identity, it makes it easier to dehumanize them, to think about them with less generosity. And that's kind of one of the big challenges of culture wars. If you get these mega identities forming, then you can start to think of the other side as wrong about everything, not just a few things, which is a worry. And then Ezra Klein, in his book, Why We're Polarized, kind of one of the later pieces, more recent pieces on this, he makes a really important point, is that once you've got more and more rolled into these identities, these cultural identities, when you activate one identity on one particular issue, you activate all of them. And each time you activate those identities, when you're appealing to people in terms of their identity or their cultural concerns, they strengthen, those identities strengthen. So it becomes quite self-reinforcing, is the conclusion of that work. Is once you get down this route of cultural identities being core part of your politics or your political scene or media discussion, it becomes quite hard to row back from it, because you get this kind of natural process where more and more issues are rolled in, more and more that gets tied up in your identities, and each time you talk about it, it reinforces those identity politics. So that was just it from me in terms of why we were looking at it and why it's really important, because the coverage of it has gone up hugely, and there is a path here that's quite dangerous in terms of cultural division, we think, in terms of the academic work. That's it from me. I mean, I just want to, we're doing more on this. If you want more, this is a huge, unfortunately, it's a very large report. It's 157 slides in the report that we did on culture wars, but it's quite flickable through. But if you wanted to have a look at it, that's the link to it there. But Gideon's going to do a much better job of just pulling out some key highlights from it now. Gideon.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. I'm sure not better, but I will pick up on some of the points that you've made. So as Bobby said, this is from a large-scale study that we ran at the end of last year with King's. So I think much of it will still apply, but some things will change. So we're going to be following up, as Bobby said, so exploring, for example, changes in the views of what woke means will be an interesting thing, even just over the last 12 months. What's happened with that? But I'm going to talk through 5 key findings from this research. And the first one, to pick up on Bobby's point again, is that culture wars are both real, but also the public feels are exaggerated from the top down. So if we just kind of scroll through some of these points, so nearly half agree that the UK is divided by culture wars. So there is a sense that the UK is divided. It's probably worth pointing out that we're not as bad as some other countries on that measure, notably places like the States. So we're not as bad as other places around the world, but nevertheless, around half of us think we are divided. But there is also quite a strong sense that the media especially, but also politicians, exaggerate culture wars and make things feel worse than they really are, and they use it as a political tactic. So there is that sense of it is partly imposed top down, but it is not a completely artificial construct. Only 12% think that culture wars only exist on media and social media and don't exist in real life. So there is definitely something there, even if we think it is exaggerated. So that's point one. Point two, always worth remembering that unlike the rest of us weirdos sitting up here, I'm sure not at all any of you there or online, most people, this is not, most people don't pay huge amounts of attention to what's going on in politics. Awareness of many of these issues is low, and the reactions are often actually quite different between different groups and not always in the same way as you might think. So, for example, awareness of many of those culture war terms, apart from white privilege, which was reasonably well known, the kind of the dark green line there, the dark green figure is how many people know a lot or have read a lot about these things, but a whole range of others like being woke, metropolitan elite, even kind of culture wars as a topic itself, awareness is pretty low. I mean, actually, when we just ask people to describe what culture wars means in their own terms, only around 4 in 10 people couldn't say anything. And the types of topics they did mention would tend to be quite broad brush ones around race relations or religion. They weren't really the real hot topic issues that you see in the media. Hardly anyone mentioned Black Lives Matter, for example. And at the same time, when we ask people how they react to some of these terms, so like if someone described you as woke, would you consider it a compliment or an insult? Actually, people are pretty split. I mean, the sort of the largest group say, I've got absolutely no idea what you're talking about. But, as many people find it a compliment as find it an insult. And there are clear demographic differences on these. Remainers, Labour supporters, young people in particular, actually, that's not great. I like being called woke. Much less so if you're a Leave supporter, a Conservative, or older. So there's kind of divisions out there. And in any case, awareness is quite low, although we'll be updating some of this and we'll see where it goes. Third point, of all the things that we do look at, free speech and political correctness does seem to be quite a hot topic, a bit of a kind of something that is specific, has specific British concerns. Again, this is just as part of the study, we ran some kind of global comparisons. And so this is a question, where would you place your scale? Where would you place yourself on a scale of 0 to 7, where 0, the blue line is that people are too easily offended, 7, the sort of the nice teal color, apparently, according to PowerPoint, we need to be sensitive and change the way that people talk. And you can see that the UK is the most sort of pro-free speech, anti-quote-unquote political correctness. We should just talk about the way that we should just talk about some of these issues and not worry about people being too easily offended. Generally, if we talk about kind of cancel culture or no platforming in universities, there's relatively little support for that. Those types of actions. So there's something about free speech and kind of political correctness gone mad that does resonate quite strongly with the British public, or at least with most of the British public. There is a proportion, the sort of the more progressive group, who are much more in favour of cancel culture or no platforming and things like that, if concerned about offending others. But generally, it does seem to be there's a specific British issue going on there. There are also the dangers of kind of polarization and negative views of the other group that Bobby described. We do see some signs on that. So I think all of this work, generally, there's a sort of sense of things to be concerned about, although not yet at the kind of maybe the US level where it's affecting absolutely everything in our lives. But there are definite concerns in terms of how we view these other groups. The groups of people have got different views to us. So if you kind of go through here, this is like a thermometer question. We ask a group of people how you feel about those who hold the opposite view to you. So if, for example, you're in favour of COVID lockdowns, how do you feel about people who are anti-COVID lockdowns? If you're a Labour supporter, how do you feel about Conservative supporters? And you can see on most of those, there is clearly a group. The sort of the blue, the number on the left is how you feel about people who hold opposite views to you. So on that top one, if you're in favour of COVID lockdowns, on a scale of 0 to 100, you only feel 23 about people who are anti-lockdowns, but you feel much more positive about your own group. But actually, what you can see there is that some of the biggest gaps are for some of these newer culture war identity type issues, like lockdowns, Black Lives Matter, and trans rights, more so than even Brexit and certainly party politics, which we know that generally Brexit identities have tended to be stronger than party political identities, but even so, both of those don't create quite the same antipathy towards the other group, your opposing group, than some of these more cultural identity issues. So there are concerns there about how you feel about the other group. I mean, the thing to sort of overlay onto this is that it tends to be those on the more, again, kind of quote unquote liberal progressive side of the argument who feel more negatively towards their opponents than those on the more kind of traditional conservative side of the argument. So there are concerns about how we feel about this, and clearly there's dangers if these do develop into these mega identities. We could be creating this sort of othering of our kind of value and political opponents. But it's not quite as bad as it seems. There's actually as many people in the middle as there are in the extremes. Bobby's group at King's carried out a segmentation of this research and kind of divided the population up into 4 groups, each around about a quarter or so. So there are the progressives, who are group 1, who are the youngest group, high level of educations, kind of most likely to be concerned about women's rights, minority rights, trans rights, very, very likely to disagree with the idea that political correctness has gone mad. So there is that one group, but then you've kind of got big groups in the middle. You have the moderate group who are similar to progressives on some things like support for minority rights, but similar to more traditional groups on other things, like they do also think that political correctness has gone too far. You've got a group who you can never forget about, who are the ones in the sort of disengaged group, who generally don't feel strongly about anything. And then you also have on the other side to the progressives, another around 1 in 4 who are the more traditionalist group, much older, tend to be more men than women, particularly nostalgic for things around kind of the country's past and the British Empire. So there are these groups, but the point is that we tend to focus particularly on the extremes rather than the groups in the middle. And the groups in the middle, they kind of feel they change in their views. Sometimes they're more on the progressive spectrum, sometimes they're more on the traditionalist spectrum, sometimes they just don't care. And we can see that on other things and other types of analysis we've done as well. For example, on Brexit, just a reminder that we shouldn't sort of lump everybody under just one hat, one identity hat. This is a kind of a fairly standard values axis where sort of the horizontal axis is whether you're economically left or right wing. The vertical axis is whether your kind of values kind of authoritarian or liberal. And if we sort of plot all these groups, if they're going to come through on this, keep going. Let's see. No, the names aren't appearing. They don't look like. So that won't work very well. Go back again. So all I'll say on that previous one, therefore, is that you can divide. There's lots of groups in the middle, but even in the Brexit group, there are 2 different groups. There's a sort of a traditionalist group and a more globalist, economically right-wing, but also more liberal group. There's also 2 Remain groups. There's a sort of a more moderate Remain group who are quite central, and then there's another Remain group who are the ones who stand out most, actually, who are the ones in the sort of the bottom right-hand corner, who are very left-wing, very liberal, who are the very liberal progressive Remain groups. But they think they're quite different to most of the other groups out there. They really stand out, and they're only a small proportion of the population. And the other point is that actually, finally, I'm going to end here. A culture war thriving, despite the thoroughness, wonderfulness, and general great thinking that's gone into this culture wars report that Bobby and I have done. It's not always the best way to understand some of these issues. There's lots of different ways we can look at some of this. We can look generationally, for example. We can look at, there's actually, as Bobby says, sort of in terms of many issues, there are not that many differences there are fewer differences by sort of identity than there are in terms of your views of your sort of your tribe and your cultural values. So just as an example, this is from our very latest issues index that we carry out every month at Ipsos Mori. What are the biggest issues facing the country? We got the environment was the top highest score for the environment we've ever seen in the issues index since we started asking it in 1974. But there is no difference on the top 4 issues between Conservative and Labour supporters. You barely get a kind of a paper between them. So many of these kind of issues-based points, trying to put it in sort of cultural or identity terms is not the right way to think about it. There are differences, sort of some on the second order priorities, but we shouldn't exaggerate some of these differences and shouldn't look at everything through a culture wars frame. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gideon. That's brilliant. So we're going to move on to Zoe, and I guess it's well open to you in terms of what you focus on, but I think certainly in terms of the media's role in this, for good and bad, it'd be great to get your reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting what you were saying, because before you mentioned woke, I was thinking, yes, and then suddenly woke kind of trickled in, and then there was a tsunami of sort of people using woke and a bit of pressure to use that term. And I think, unfortunately, what happens when these words blow through, which they do with such strength and frequency now, is that they of course get hollowed out and sort of start to lose their meaning. But in the case of woke, because it's situated within the culture wars, which is the sort of media issue that keeps on giving, or so editors think, we are still kind of stuck with it, and there hasn't been a kind of more concise alternative. So I think the media, it's an interesting, I mean, certainly probably not everyone in this room is a huge fan of The Telegraph, but nonetheless, that is the paper I have my column in. And I think there's a line between flagging up issues that are sensitive and do need to be aired, and that in airing them or critiquing some of the kind of orthodoxies of, to use that word woke or the culture wars, you are exerting some kind of free speech. The problem is that very quickly that becomes, it becomes hyperbolic, it becomes excessive, and you've raised the pressure, you've identified something, you've admirably shown light on it, and then you've upped the ante on it, and then it becomes part of the ecosystem, whether it's getting the right amount of attention or not. I do, however, think that when people accuse newspapers or media of, hugely kind of whipping up discontent, I mean, I think you can see that across the board with trying to stoke anxiety about absolutely everything. But I think the culture wars is interesting, because I've actually been saying since the beginning that it's a real war. It's not a culture war, it's a real war. And actually, okay, it doesn't have tanks in it and stuff, but it really is like about fundamental things that are at stake, violations of very fundamental things to do with epistemology, what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false, what it's okay to say, what it isn't, in ways that aren't necessarily rooted in, the law or reality or anything like that. So I think in as much as newspapers have started to kind of flock to these things, whatever side they're on, I think that the issues at stake genuinely are kind of extremely important. And I think at the beginning, nobody quite knew how to frame that. And they thought, oh, well, maybe these issues are just, it's a media storm, doesn't matter. Ordinary people are going about their lives. But actually, ordinary people going about their lives are facing this stuff. And I was interested in what you said, Bobby, about the fact that, well, it was the sort of top down versus, but then the versus was media and politicians. But actually, when people say they're not, what does it have to do with them? Workplaces and the corporate world and all of these places are absolutely, more than government, more than anything the state is doing, is almost the first, we're very enthusiastic adopters of some of this stuff. And I think, for instance, diversity and inclusion policies are actually, in many cases, quite politicized. I'm not saying they're not good or that their aims aren't noble and right, but I am saying that workplaces have actually become quite political through some of those policies and the way they've been applied. So a lot of people are coming up against ideology in places that I don't think they were before. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but maybe I should hand over.
Yeah, let's see. Thank you for that. So that's great. So Emilio, from a political point of view, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, yeah, kind of to the point about the media. I think, yeah, of course, the media makes these things into a bigger deal than they are because, it sells papers and it sells clicks and whatever. I think the interesting thing about your graph that showed how the use of this term has increased over time, it's kind of similar to the use of social media over time. And obviously, I think having these websites like Twitter and Facebook, etc., where people can argue with each other really passionately without having to actually speak to each other face to face, has obviously fueled this stuff. And then I think that feeds back into the media because, we in the media see what gets people angry on the internet and what gets lots of clicks and lots of shares on the internet. And we then kind of reflect that in the things that we write. I say we is just like I'm every journalist, but in politically we don't do it that much, to be honest, this stuff, but you can see why and how it works, definitely. And so in a sense, I think, yeah, we're just a kind of reflection of the social media world because that's what people obviously want to read about. But that does, yes, obviously, again, inflate the actual genuine importance of it in the world or how much people do actually care. I think looking at some of your graphs, I would imagine that, yeah, when you ask people, how much do you care about these issues that are cultural related issues, they will say, yeah, I do. I feel this about how patriotic I am, or I feel like this about, how much I think that it is too politically correct or whatever. But then when you just ask people what are the most important issues to you daily, they say climate and they say the pandemic and things like that. And all of those things obviously can end up being politicized in a culture war as well. But I think when people answer those questions more broadly, what do you actually care about? They're not thinking about, I hate climate denialists. They're just saying, I'm worried about the climate. It's a different thing, I think. Or they're not saying, I hate lockdown or I hate lockdown skeptics. They're saying, I'm worried about the pandemic because it's got a big impact on my future. So I think in terms of what people are interested to read about, etc., and what we end up writing about as a result, yeah, there isn't necessarily a marriage between that and the things that people actually care about because they actually end up voting about it when it comes to an election. And then the other thing I was going to say was that, yeah, obviously I come at it slightly from a sort of politicsy perspective of how the parties are thinking about it. And the impression I get is that I think Labour would like to think that it can approach these issues in a way that makes it more appealing to voters, but it doesn't know how, and it's worried about doing so, and so it avoids saying anything at the moment, at least. I think the Conservatives, the sense I get, I think there's this thing where the Conservatives, they desperately want to stoke a culture war. I don't really think that's true. I think the Conservatives want to just keep something along those lines kind of bubbling under the surface because it plays well to some of their voters, and I think it plays well to their base, and it's a way of kind of keeping them happy. There's like groups of Conservative MPs in Parliament who really care about this stuff and want to put pressure on Boris and the cabinet to do more about it. And I think to some extent, you put Nadine Dorries in the culture role, DCMS role, and it means that some of these Tories on the backbenches are kind of happy. It kind of just keeps a few people happy. But I don't think the Conservatives would want it to blow up into this election, win or lose issue at all. Having said that, I would say that there is one person in Downing Street who's really relevant to this. Her name is Munira Mirza, and she worked for Boris at City Hall, and now she is the head of the policy unit in Downing Street, and she's very interested in this stuff. And she basically, I think, wrote the Sewell report on race that came out a few months ago, which basically said, racial issues in this country aren't as bad as a lot of people think they are. And, the problems with it are, if we say that they're bad, then, ethnic minorities will assume that the system is rigged against them and therefore they won't engage with it. It's this like self-fulfilling issue. That's basically her way of thinking. That's exactly what she believes. And so that report was basically written by her. So it's interesting that Boris has got someone in that is focused on this stuff and does want to kind of drag it in a particular direction. But I don't think they want to make a massive song and dance about it. They just want to make a bit of noise every now and then to kind of keep people happy. And that will play well with the electorate to some extent, but obviously it's not the thing that voters actually vote on.
I think can I jump in? The piece that's missing from what we've said so far is academia. And I think what's interesting is the way there's now this war between, to some degree, aspects of the government, the media and academia. And I think academia perhaps wasn't quite as much in the public eye before for the kinds of ideas that it's coming up with. So for instance, the Telegraph, there's a lot of sort of academics are responsible for, toxic concepts that emerge from, I don't know, post-structuralism, postmodernism, but that's older hat, but more like things like intersectionality, things that, some of this debate, the trans debates, which people locate, coming from gender studies departments or whatever. And there's this very scathing, there is a sort of tribal sort of idea that's advanced of like tribal warfare between sort of academics who are often, they used to be just left to kind of get on with their mad ideas, and now suddenly these ideas have seeped into the public domain and are actually having a really, really influential effect. And I think it's just been very interesting in 2012 or 13, I went back and did an MPhil in gender studies actually, and then did a PhD in history at Sussex. And so I've been immersed in both of the worlds kind of simultaneously. And I was very interested to see how suddenly like intersectionality, which, it suddenly is becoming something that's kind of bandied around and I think when we're trying to look at the difference between the US and the UK, some of those differences level out when you think about the very international nature of academic discourse and ideas. And I think a lot of those ideas that have kind of been coming out in the US and maybe are used more freely by the New York Times or whatever than here, nonetheless, there's a lot of overlap, and that is an academic thing. And that sphere of academia has swollen and expanded because of prominent people leaving or feeling they're being hounded out, or and it's made national news in quite a sort of it's quite a sort of frequent way. So I think somehow we need to think about what's happening in sort of humanities departments in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US comparison, we're talking about this a lot in terms of what's next for our research projects, and talking to lots of academics in the US and the UK about the extent to which we can think of the UK on a path towards an American outcome. And I'm always in two minds about this. When we release this report, we get a lot of interview requests from European countries, journalists about, we're seen as a bit of a staging post, as a mid-Atlantic staging post, where they're seeing that we are potentially their future, and they're trying to get a little inkling of where we're going in order to try and avert it from their position. And I'm not sure about that because of the massive cultural, historical, structural differences between the UK and the US in this. Not least the media environment is entirely different, but the political structures are entirely different as well. And obviously they've got a entirely different cultural history, particularly around race, to us. So I'm kind of, I can't work out whether we're too worried or not worried enough, I suppose, about this. And I think we can take too much solace, some ways, from that point about we're not so far apart on the issues. So in the academic literature, there is something about a distinction between issue polarization, where you've got difference of opinions on a particular issue, and then affective polarization, so emotional polarization. And an emotional polarization you can have without disagreeing about the issues. It's not that I disagree with you on the issues, it's just I don't like you, and I don't trust you, or I don't want to connect with you in any sort of way. So, and that can be pretty corrosive just without disagreement on particular issues. And I slightly worry about that too. And then, but I find the politics of it, again, really hard to see whether this is an unjustifiable political tactic that is sowing division for short-term gain, or a really quite legitimate reflection of genuine cultural concerns that the public have. Because there was this great report by UK in a Changing Europe, which looked at the values positions of MPs, compared it to activists within the Conservative and Labour Party, compared it to members of the Conservative and Labour Party, and then compared it to the Labour Party voters and Conservative Party voters. And what that showed is that Labour is way off. Labour MPs and activists are way off to the more liberal side than their own supporters, and even further off from the electorate in general, whereas actually the Conservative Party members and MPs are almost in line with the voters overall, most in terms of that cultural axis that Gideon showed. So there is a sense in which conservative political leaders could legitimately be saying we're reflecting genuine concerns about the speed of culture change within society. And it's a really difficult one to see how, and I'll say one more thing and then allow people to maybe come back on it. That when you read all the US books on this about how they ended up here and how do you avert it, none of them tell you anything you can possibly do to stop it. It's really, they've only got one response, which is rely on the virtue of leaders and the political leaders and the media to not stoke it up or to calm it down. There is no there's very little structural response, or you could say we need more deliberative democracy that brings people closer to these types of decisions. You could say that you need more regulation of social media platforms, those types of things. There's those types of things that you could do. But in the end, all of the books, when you get to their conclusions, pretty much rely on political virtue, as in not to sow division just for the sake of short-term political gains. And that's really tough, I think, as an appeal. It becomes quite, well, it relies on persuasion of political leaders and media leaders in an environment where emotional extreme views are rewarded with clicks and everything else. So it becomes quite a difficult thing to do. I just, preamble to your sense of threat from this. How worried are you about this as an issue? What do you see as the consequences? And what can we do to avert it if you are worried about it? Anything in that space? Let's come to you, Gideon, first, actually.
Thanks.
Nice, easy set of questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I suppose I'll take my view on it is that without wanting to repeat exactly what has just been said, there's clearly signs of concern there, and there are signs, I think, that the Brexit is not everything, but I think that sort of the Remain and Leave identities, a lot of it is, if it's going to coalesce around something, it would probably coalesce around the Remain and Leave identity. So I was at a launch for the Nuffield 2019 general election book last week, and they talked about the election being a result of BBC, so Boris, Brexit and Corbyn. And one of the questions was, is Brexit going to be an issue in the next election? And there's an interesting response around possibly the government, slightly similar to what you were saying, Minnie, about the sort of bubbling under. The government doesn't want Brexit to be obviously to be a disaster, but maybe there's some benefits there to sort of have it bubbling away. And actually how although we're seeing Brexit identities become slightly less powerful than they were a couple of years ago, they're still much stronger held identities than party political identities, for example, and whether they just become less about Brexit, but just more about the person that you are. And in that way could still play quite an important role going ahead into the next election. You see, for example, I think one aspect of that is still, although the Conservative ratings and Boris Johnson ratings have been coming down over the last few months, not just because of Sleaze, they've been dripping down since the summer. But what's still very noticeable is that Boris Johnson's ratings amongst his own supporters are very strong, much more so than Keir Starmer. And I think to some extent these identities are playing a role in that, and that's a big part of his appeal. He's still keeping on to a lot of his previous voters, and that's putting him in a much stronger position looking ahead to the next election than Keir Starmer, who's got real problems about divisions amongst Labour Party supporters who can't really make up their mind whether they like him or not.
Yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know really. So the question is, am I worried? I get worried sometimes when I just talk to individual people sometimes. I do have some friends that are into the culture around the pandemic, and they're really anti-vax and anti-lockdown and things like that. And sometimes when I talk to those people, I worry a little bit. And I used to have a bunch of friends that were really, really, really pro-Trump to the point of believing in lots of the really mad conspiracies. And so I worry sometimes that the internet can basically, it's just a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. And I think that that's conspiracy theories have always existed, but it's just easier and easier for people to send themselves down rabbit holes and meet other people that are like-minded and convince themselves of whatever they believe. And sometimes that worries me, but I'm not that worried because I think that that's just a pretty small minority of people, and so therefore it's not too much of an issue. And I think that often some of this stuff that we're talking about arguments about race or about gender or sexuality or whatever is I think generally you find that when you look at this research, often you find that people agree with all of those values. They're just often worried about being pushed too fast. Often, like, people don't like seeing change that moves too fast. But we've seen that tension kind of throughout history, right? We've had various changes on these cultural issues for years and years. Decades ago, we'd have been having the argument just about homosexuality in the first place, and there would have been a lot of people that were resistant to change about it. And then now we're at a place where, basically no one thinks that that's a problem at all. So I think these things, it's often the case, I think, that the kind of liberal side of it just wins kind of slowly. But it's just the tension against it is just about trying to be pushed too fast. People they don't like things to change faster than they're kind of comfortable with, which that ends up often, I think, being what it's about. And in that respect, yeah, I don't really worry, just because I think that things are kind of moving in a direction that where like the kind of liberal side, I suppose, does win out. And then on your point about the US, yeah, it's interesting. I think that. The US is very different to us, but we are often quite sort of USified by, again, social media. We've got all these free speech, liberal talking companies that, we're kind of bought over there, that we end up sort of sucking up. And obviously we're so dependent on their culture. But I think we can probably rest assured that the US is always going to be more mad than we are, right? Because as we get madder, like, they're going to get even madder and madder. So we're always going to be a few steps behind. So maybe it's okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. I'm glad that you're reminding me about the biggest division being Brexit, because actually, to me, I think that's quite a good thing to be dividing people, because it is political. It's not a matter of debate about what constitutes woman, or whether so-and-so is racist, or if that constitutes racism or that doesn't. And, it's actually not identity politics in the way that everything else is. And so I think it's interesting that actually what comes to the surface is the biggest division is actually something that is a very substantial issue. The fact then that it becomes, and I don't mean the other ones aren't substantial, but this is actually a substantial political and vaguely geopolitical issue. And I think one of the things that disturbs me about the current climate of neurotic obsession, almost, at least among some people, with some of these identitarian issues, is that it does take people's attention away from geopolitics, from trade, from the army, from the military, from whatever the kind of quite huge things going on, whatever Russia's doing, what China's doing, what our relationship is to those things. People aren't paying attention to that because they're paying attention to what Professor said. Obviously, I say people, I think maybe the data would suggest a small number of people, but that is definitely kind of what seems to sort of rise to the surface. I think, I do find it concerning that the logics of the culture wars are so liberally, they ooze out. So, I was quite disturbed by how COVID so quickly became a culture war. I found it strange that people that are with me on some things, like things to do with free speech and things, kind of took it into this direction of the government is a conspiracy to control us, and that all our civil liberties are being restrained, and masks are evil, and the kind of space between anti-lockdown is smaller and smaller between that and anti-vax, and then conspiracy theory. And it was just very interesting to me that it just went into this kind of mad idea. Now it's there's a lot of for instance in universities, I have a lot of friends who work in universities, and some of them are ill disposed to continued restrictions, and they think, oh, what's the point of masks anymore? But it's become a matter of, just like it did in the US, like the mask symbolizes being left wing, and that's weird, and I think that's worrying, because I think that's an example of something that shouldn't be. a culture war issue and is. I thought the concept of mega identity is just so handy, and that's so true. I mean, that you know, the term journalists use is probably just tribalism or what tribe you're in. And I think that the thing that worries me about the mega identity and what you said about kind of, you know, I hate you rather than that I disagree with you, is that I think that one of the manifestations of the culture wars is also just a sort of atmosphere of constraint in us on a social level. So I think for the first time in my life anyway, I'm aware of both myself minding, well, obviously not that much, but minding my P's and Q's, even among friends, and knowing other friends who have to mind their P's and Q's. And I've been at social gatherings where things get very, very, very vicious and upsetting very quickly, not about, you know, whether we should have the Vietnam War or something, but about, yeah, like, again, what constitutes a woman. I mean, these things are so yeah, emotionally I don't know, the fallout can be huge, and so on the social level, I think there's really been, that's a strange form of divisions also within families. I think there is an atmosphere of constraint, and I think some of the freedom of speech in sort of violations that universities are accused of, it's not quite that they're saying no, you can't say that, but my impression, based on speaking to people and reading things and talking to undergraduates and stuff, is that people just don't want to risk saying something that could be considered a microaggression or anything else. So if you're in that, it's a frame of mind at that point rather than a concrete violation of your rights. So that's what scared me. My final thing about what to do about it, I think that these people saying, "Oh, just have faith in the media," like that makes absolutely zero sense to me. I mean, why would you just hope that people will arbitrarily try to make everything okay? I mean, that's not going to happen. But it seems to me to be an issue of, you know, economy of attention. And again, that goes back to the geopolitics thing. In a social media climate, in the sort of clickbait climate, in a sort of climate in which many people have fairly, well, I don't know. I mean, let's not go there with like survival is assured, but there seems to be a new space in which to give a lot of attention to certain things that aren't to do perhaps with survival, aren't to do with geopolitics. There's no, you know, there's no world war going on right now, thank God. So I think it's to do with what there isn't, to take people away from it, and asking why there's so much attention to be put onto it.
Yeah,
that would be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the distraction cost of some of this, it shouldn't be ignored in terms of
more concise way of putting it.
Yeah. No, that's so. I mean, just a quick reflection before we come to audience questions is, I suppose I've written a book on generational differences and how that changes over time, and that's absolutely right. That is this kind of sense of tension between generations, and it slowly moving in a liberal direction, or, you know, what Inglehart would call towards self-expression values from survival values. You've got that kind of ongoing thing. I think there may be something different here because of the focus that's been put on it as a political issue, which is unusual. That is unusual. We've lost a lot of the economic focus in lots of our discussion, and we've shifted it to cultural. And I do wonder slightly about that, about what we've seen in, you know, Ipsos data is the largest age divide that we've ever measured consistently since Brexit. And is that coincidence that we've started to put these culture change issues at the center of our politics? And then you've got this automatic generational divide that comes in on the back of that. And you're kind of building that into your politics. And this is where lots of academics in the US worry about. As soon as you've got that dynamic in your politics, it becomes quite hard, because you've got one side that thinks they've got demography on their side as they're getting more voters coming into the population, and they get pulled very much towards the leading edge of cultural change issues of the younger generations. And you've got the other side who think they've got demography going against them because they've got just older voters, and they're very incentivized to accentuate the extremism on the other side by saying, look, they're all woke warriors, you don't want to go near them. And you get into this quite bad dynamic of emphasizing difference between the two. So that would be the thing. And then just on consequences, the thing that we're trying to think about, and it'd be great to get audience reflections on this, is obviously you've got Capitol Hill riots is kind of, that's one potential long-term consequences, say, you know, where you get so immersed in your own identity on your side that you don't accept democratic results that go against you. And that's kind of like, you know, potentially as one bad outcome that you could follow that down. Then you do have a more general cohesion sort of thing, community cohesion, social cohesion, where there's less cooperation between different groups and all of that. And we get a strong sense of that in focus groups that we do in the US compared to the UK. Not nearly the sense of, well, a lot more fractious in terms of those kind of identity divides between those two things. Then you get your points about extremists, I think, and that is an issue about, it's less about the whole population, it's more you get splinter cells of people that get pulled down rabbit holes if you get these identity things. And then I think you get your point, which is bad policy decisions or bad decisions because you're not open to conversations on either side. And it's not just universities. You could argue government saying that people critical of Boris that can't come in and give a talk in government now, those types of stories, they're also not great for good policy making or good decision making. So you've got lots of levels, but it'd be great. I mean, it's great to get reflections from the audience here. Is it Grant first or wherever? Here. Yeah, audience here. Yes.
Thank you all very much. I mean, I've made about 3 pages of notes, so thank you for the exercise, both here and here. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who covered the ex-Soviet states. Although I didn't realize it at the time, I saw just what a huge cultural problem the Soviet Union had when I was on board a warship of theirs in 1983. And I saw almost exactly the same thing, the divide between the ethnicities. I saw almost exactly the same thing when I was at the Alamo in Texas a year later, so that'd be 1984. I would agree strongly with the view that the UK, thank heavens, is not in that state. My question is, who are the people who you think are fighting back? I don't want to use that, I use that in a neutral term, to mitigate the problems or the potential dangers which you highlighted of culture wars, and who aren't? And are there any groups on either side who surprise you by their actions or inactions, positive or negative? Thank you.
Oh. What a great question. I'm looking at you, Gideon. You're easiest to see from this angle.
Thanks, Bobby. So I suppose the incentives, as Bobby said, are generally for most parties to think about the short-term gain. I'm not sure any of them completely cover themselves in glory from it. Equally, I think they're clearly also examples on lots of sides, actually, as we've seen sort of from some of the kind of tragedies that we've seen recently in politics. There have been attempts to sort of demonstrate that you can have friendness of friendships across the political divides and so on, which hopefully are a healthy thing. I suppose in terms of it's been around for a while, but there are a number of groups out there who are trying to do more in terms of the deliberative space. Now, on a number of some of these are really tricky questions like climate change, like use of data, on other things, on kind of constitutional issues, on national issues. So there is definitely a kind of a constellation of people who are interested in that and trying to do good things there. They probably don't solve it on their own. I mean, I do think that I would be on the side of most politicians, and most are probably seen too badly for what they're trying to achieve. They will, they're not going out of their way to kind of create horrible divisions. Just their generally motives are good on all sides, but clearly the trouble is many of the incentives don't always work like that.
I don't know who's fighting back. in a way, no one, right? Because I feel like if you say, the person that says, why can't we all get along, probably isn't really going to get listened to. I think, it's more interesting to be divisive. And so I think that there are probably lots of people that are trying to fight back, but it's just a question of whether it's effective. I think some people are, you guys, right? You guys are doing lots of data and trying to work out what people actually think and whether or not these things are actually real and in what way they are real, if they're real. And I think that's obviously really helpful and really relevant. But most people aren't going to engage with that, I suppose, so it's kind of difficult in that respect. And I think, the parties, I think they do make it, they kind of make it worse, right? But that's their job. Their job in a way is to be political and to take sides and take quite strong lines on those sides. And that's how they win elections. I think that, like I say, I think that neither of them want to open this particular kind of Pandora's box too widely, but they the Tories want to dabble in it. I think Labour kind of knows that it has to engage with it to some extent. And then in terms of who's the worst, I suppose the risk obviously is that I think is that if the mainstream parties don't engage with it in some way, you end up with some fringe group that can become a very popular and kind of take that space. It means that there's a vacuum that could be filled, and then that gives someone a platform to be, to grow something that is potentially more extreme. And I think that often there's a limit on that, right? So, for example, in the referendum, Dominic Cummings didn't want Nigel Farage to head up the main campaign because he knew that there was a cap on Nigel Farage's popularity in this country, and that if he was the leader of the campaign, it might not get over the line. So I think, that's probably true. There is a kind of cap to how the sort of more extreme side of things can win in terms of popularity. But yeah, that is the risk, I think. If the mainstream parties don't go for it, then there is a vacuum that will be filled.
I guess my perspective would be slightly different because I'm in the war as a kind of columnist, as a polemic pundit. And I suppose that one way of answering that question, if you're on the side of thinking freedom of speech is imperiled, and there are some, if you think, oh, the woke thing has gone too far, what's happening in the US is an example of what a fight back could look like on that side. I'm not saying that I'm not really trying to say one side is right or wrong in this context, but again, we've imported a lot of American ideas, and there's a huge backlash organized, increasingly kind of happening now in the US. There's bestseller books kind of churning out about it. John McWhorter, an African-American professor at Columbia, has just come out with a book called Woke Racism. And that was, was number one in the top 10 in the New York Times immediately. And that's quite interesting because the New York Times also, created what Barry Weiss said was a hostile environment. She's now gone and created a huge media empire dedicated to doing what she says that the mainstream media isn't doing because they are hobbled by woke, as it were. And then, of course, in the US, they've set up a whole university, the University of Austin, which is explicitly for the people that have left or felt hounded out of existing universities because of things to do with their personal opinion, because of what they've said about, whether they've been accused of some distant thing that has now been construed as racism, or in the case of Kathleen Stock at Sussex, her views on trans. So they're quite concrete entities now, whether it be bestsellers, universities, or media empires that are trying to do something different. And the US has these people, Barry Weiss is, and John McWhorter, they have very grand ideas of, just like in America, the culture war is worse, so the solution is grander. And it's about setting up new movie studios. It's literally about building a new culture from scratch. So that's quite interesting. Here, I don't think anything like that sort of thing is happening. And that might just be a reflection of the fact that, it is definitely much less. These issues about free speech and stuff are just simply much less bad here. And I wonder what the people, it's interesting because my feeling is that the side that these people are opposing is quite hegemonic. So I don't know what fight back they would need to be doing, given that a lot of those ideas are sort of embedded in institutional culture now. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a different structure here to the US, where that is already well protected in some ways, or is it not exactly the same? I suppose on my reflections on it is, that, you know, the trouble with culture wars generally is it's incredibly difficult to engage with it well, but it's also impossible to ignore from a political perspective. So it gets quite getting your approach to it correct. So to your question, I think Labour Party have not been that engaged with it for all sorts of reasons, through fear and through not having that sort of clear.
Fear is the most powerful form of word.
Yes, I agree. But that's, yes, that sort of, and I think they would, you know, what you can't do is, and I speak as an instance, you know, at a university institution where all these types of debates come up quite a lot, is what you can't do is get dragged into a tactical reactive response to each issue as it comes up, because it's just going to keep coming. That's the nature of culture change. It's going to keep coming. So it needs to be more strategic than that. And I think Labour Party perhaps wasn't in the position to come up with that kind of strategic view that you could say maybe Bernie Sanders had more emphasis on getting that correct, about not engaging on every issue, picking which issue you do engage on more carefully and in a more long term, with a longer term view about what that was going to do. But I do think that is incredibly difficult. But I agree a lot with Emilio's point about, I think we did a massive study on immigration attitudes and perceptions and misperceptions and how that all related to the debate before the Brexit votes, are more in the mid 2010s. And one of the only things that people agreed with on immigration, depending on either side of the debate, is that we weren't talking about immigration enough in the country, because it did feel quite closed down as an issue. And that's where, when you got that sense that we're not allowed to talk about something or it's being closed down, that's where things pop up or reactions come, either through enigmatic leaders or different political movements that come through that give a voice to that. So I think that closing down is a really bad response to it. And then on the more positive side, there are really good initiatives like the Together Coalition or the Together Alliance, which is, you know, Archbishop of Canterbury, lots of civil society organizations trying to make those types of connections between people that are very, very practical, none of this kind of academic theoretical stuff, but very, very practical in people's communities of interest in all sorts of different ways, to try to bridge those types of divides. A lot of this work is hard work, grassroots, and with individuals and individual communities, not just these big studies that we do. And I think that there are some people acting on very practical things to bring people together in different sorts of ways, and that's a key response. Is it a question? No? Well, there's one at the back there. Sorry, Grant, did you have something else? Yes, please.
I find it a little misleading to suggest that in the UK, free speech is, you know, at such a high level in comparison to other countries. And I'd just like to draw attention to the issue that Keir Starmer raised within his own party of anti-Semitism. I think he and Emmanuel Macron as well they've stated that taking an anti-Zionist position is equivalent to being anti-Semitic. And that effectively has completely stifled that particular debate. And Zionism as an ideology can certainly be criticized in terms of the effects that it has. And so I think that for Keir Starmer to make that statement really is to suppress free speech on that particular issue. And so, although the statistics show that the UK, you know, is a place where free speech is welcomed, actually there are massive constraints on free speech in the UK, because nobody in their right mind would like to be labeled as anti-Semitic, and therefore to speak out against the effects of Zionism is effectively a taboo. Please discuss.
Please discuss. Anyone? Amelia?
Definitely not. I'm not getting into that stuff.
Okay. Zoe?
I would just say, don't read my columns. They'll just make you furious. No, I shouldn't engage on that one either, because
I guess the problem with that is it's a reflection of where Labour's at, right? You know, basically it's Keir Starmer struggles to say things about that because there's been a culture war going on in the Labour Party, which was massively exacerbated between 2015 and 2020. And I think that is part of the reason why that's a very difficult issue for them to address.
Yeah. Well, they're a demonstrant.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, please. You got a... Yes, please.
Thank you very much. This is a slightly different tack, but I've had long experience of the US, both of living there, visiting, and it struck me that the way that the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd issue, was transferred almost wholesale to the British context was really quite dangerous and quite misrepresentative, and that it was followed by the statues toppling. And in a way, maybe the government was right, and it sort of soft pedaled it, and it allowed the protest to happen against all the rules, and it's sort of gone away. But I do wonder, transporting US example direct to the UK wholesale, it gets embraced by quite a limited group of people. What does it take for a backlash to set in here? Because that's not representative of the country at large. When people start toppling statues, you can maybe topple a statue in Bristol, you can maybe daub graffiti on Churchill in London, but if you start doing that other places, there are going to be people who say, whose country is this? And when does that happen?
So just from a US-UK comparison, just interested in your reflections, because you must have a...
Well, I didn't, my impression of the US is probably no better than anyone else, because I was here for the kind of, I mean, the efflorescence of the BLM and the extremes, and definitely just, I read about those in the same newspapers. I do think there's a lot of people are now, well, some people are starting to now try to approach and treat that thing of, we shouldn't, you know, America's history of race and it's the contemporary manifestations of that history are not appropriately applied directly here. And there are members of, you know, there are young Black people writing about this now, and so it is becoming something that that is being thought about in a sort of in a fairly sophisticated way, as well as probably as well as less less sophisticated. But I think this, you're right to point out the regionality of it. I mean, it's clear that in some places there's going to be a very different reaction than in Oxford, you know, to taking away roads, or to, you know, in Bristol and in London. So, and I think maybe that's a classic case of sort of reporting bias, is that I don't actually know what would happen in certain places in Kent or something if you started to try to do that. I guess, yeah, much more of that's been going on in America because of the, you know, generals associated with the Confederacy and slavery and things like that. So yeah, it's a good point. And I, you know, when does a backlash begin? I mean, I don't think there's been enough statue toppling here for the backlash to really have a catalyst. So I think that kind of got under, some happened, and then it was, you know, these stories pop up every now and then, but it's not quite as much. So it just depends on how the whole thing plays out but I think we are a bit behind America on that. But yeah, interesting point. Bit of a rambly answer.
Is there anything on that?
Not really. Okay. I mean, I think yeah, maybe there is a risk of, like I was saying before, the kind of USification of this country, and that yeah, we are at risk of just transposing the arguments that we see there. We're at risk of just transposing them here, and people, yeah, maybe would assume that we have to kind of fight the same battles in the same way, even though we might have slightly different histories, I suppose. But yeah, in terms of a backlash, I suppose, you know, in the UK, I feel like we're fairly tolerant of protests and protesting, and until it goes too far, like, yeah, someone daubs Churchill as a racist on the statue, or someone like pisses on the memorial for the policeman, you know, in the Parliament, then suddenly everyone thinks it's completely terrible and is outraged, and, you know, fair enough. But on the whole, I think as long as people kind of, that's the thing in the US, you know, there were like, there's rioting and like, you know,
Exactly.
fires and you know, it was a sort of different situation. I think if we got to that extreme, there would obviously be a massive backlash, but we haven't quite got there yet.
Yeah. There's just a sort of level of violence that because of America's, you know, well, guns could be at any scene, and the sort of Antifa versus the Proud Boys in Portland and whole sections of cities. But yeah, it really is. We are quite far away from that, and I don't know how that would be managed here.
Yeah. No, I think we are quite different, sort of contextually. There's a great book and series of analysis by people like Pippa Norris, who's UK US academic, which is actually called Cultural Backlash. So her and Ron Inglehart have looked at this, and it is that point of you cannot assume unidirectional culture change where it just flows forward in the kind of drift towards liberalism. You do get these backlash periods, and one of the big drivers of that backlash period is not like has got economic roots within it. And I think one of the core reasons why the US is ahead of us on this is they had wage stagnation and that declining economic prospect for a working stroke middle class in US terms much earlier than us, 2 decades before us. And it is that sense of a loss of a way of life for the white non-graduate population in the US is like such a major trend across all sorts of books, from Angus Deaton's and Anne Casey's Deaths of Despair to Bob Putnam writing about the upswing and those types of analysis, where it's not the economic impact itself, it's the loss of a way of life and a sense of respect and contribution among particular parts of the American population that has given this real strong sense of cultural competition between themselves and other groups. And it seems so solid as a kind of thesis and is a warning for us, I think, in some ways. That we've got to be alive to that, because while we're structurally quite different, that could be a path that we go down. It's that sense of a feeling of loss among big chunks of the population that then expresses itself in cultural concern terms. Sorry, good.
Well, some people, I mean, I interviewed Andrew Sullivan recently, and he was saying that, you know, in a way, the perfect conservative solution to that sense of a large swathe of the population feeling left behind was Brexit, and that was a political, and other, you know, that's a political answer to that sense of disenfranchisement that will stave off what the cult. In a way, it's politics displacing culture. So that might mean that we are, ironically, because of Brexit, even though it's so divisive, that might be the thing that keeps things from boiling over.
Yeah. Take back control is chosen very distinctively, and it is until people realise the disappointment, it doesn't actually improve prospects. If that happens, if it didn't actually improve prospects, then it's another example of being betrayed by a political class, and that is, we're on a long path here, not a short-term path, and we've got some risks there. Sorry, is there a question? And then, because I know we'll run through some online ones, because I'm conscious of that.
Well, it was just to talk about the way that we are polarizing this conversation by saying, on one hand, kind of we've got, you know, riots, and obviously nobody wants Proud Boy riots or violence in the streets, but actually at the same time there's kind of a narrative, a very negative narrative about, for instance, National Trust trying to provide a more balanced picture of the roots of some of this wealth being on the back of slavery. And I haven't, unfortunately, managed to go to the Hogarth exhibition, but, you know, the reports of that are, oh, this is all, you know, crap, wakery or whatever. And it does feel like one of the things that surely we should be trying to do is to have a more balanced conversation. Yeah. And, you know, I completely get some of the worries about universities, but I teach in an English department in which actually I would say that the Black Lives Matter debate has been largely positive, in that we've kind of had a really good look at expanding the range of books that we're reading, and appointed a post-colonial lecturer where before there was a freeze on any hiring. And so that there are some positive, and And surely it's more important that we begin to talk about this stuff than we all put ourselves in opposing camps and just caricature it.
Absolutely. And I do think that is part of the results from all the research the Ipsos and others have done in this area, is that actually people are not that far apart on lots of these things. And when you get them in a room together in more deliberative settings, that sense of division is just not that strong, and people can talk across these sorts of divides, and that's really important to bear in mind. So I'm just going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to go around the panel, and I'm going to read you all the questions that we were asked online, because I think we've covered quite a lot of them, but I just see which ones you want to pick up in a sort of final couple of minutes each, if that's okay. Oh, sorry, was there another question? Okay, great. So how do culture wars end? What are the genuine dangers of culture wars? We've covered quite a lot of this. Do politicians use culture wars to galvanize the public because UK issues are too complex? Well, I guess that political issues generally are too complex to simplify it. Will it get as bad here as it is in the US? We've sort of covered that a bit as well. And then finally, would encouraging media and political discourse to be all based on facts, truth, and context help to reorientate topics away from triggering culture wars? Can we get people more onto the substance of debate? So let's go in panel order. Just any reflections on those or any other things? Not, you don't have to do all of them, clearly. Gideon.
So I suppose I might just take the point in terms of getting people to focus on the substance. I mean, we have been talking about culture wars, but there is huge amounts that is done on the substance on many of the policies. We've been talking about race, for example, and BLM, and that's possibly an example where both on the one hand, you can't ignore the culture wars framing of it and discussion of it, but actually you could look at it. Culture wars isn't necessarily the most helpful framing to look at it. You can look at attitudes towards race relations in many different ways. It doesn't have to be just on this sort of this very specific BLM angle. You can see how changes have been occurring in society over decades, where the long-term trend is relatively positive, as you said, but then actually you can also look at the very sort of lived experiences and the specific experiences of ethnic minorities themselves, where they will point out that there's still a lot to be done in a whole range of areas across media, public services, government, and elsewhere. You can sort of see the response to the Cyril report, where kind of the instinctive response from many people wasn't necessarily terribly positive, but actually you talk through some of the recommendations and they went down much more much better. So kind of part of the answer is not necessarily trying to put this culture wars framing onto everything, because it doesn't always lead to the most helpful outcomes or the most productive outcomes if you want to get a proper understanding of the kind of more pragmatic or policy focused steps you have to do to deal with some of these issues.
Right. Thank you, Gideon. Zoe.
Yes, I mean, that just makes me think we've got to seek out that moderate middle, because yes, that might be where there they are. We can reframe things. I think the point about complexity is spot on. I think that absolutely the world has got so complicated that we can't even understand any. I mean, the economy, the subprime crisis really showed how even the bankers didn't understand what was going on. I mean, things are incredibly complicated. We use technologies, we don't understand how they work. I couldn't tell you exactly how the internet works. I couldn't tell you how that. So I think complexity, and I think there is something very reassuringly easy about latching onto a binary kind of position. So absolutely. And I also agree with this idea about if we could shift the style of discourse towards facts, truth, and context, that would be very valuable, because we've definitely entered an age of hyperbole and even more extreme than in the past. I think people agree on that, and that kind of hyperbolic register it just is stoked. That really is not helpful, and that is not good, and it leads to actual errors and factual errors, misconceptions, misrepresentations. So I agree with that point.
Yeah, so obviously, yeah, it'd be nice if we lived in a world where everyone was just a bit more truthful and honest, but that's not ever going to happen. Obviously, yeah, it would be good to try and talk about these things more moderately, and I think that's a good idea. but I think that that's a difficult thing to do with the internet around. And I don't know how you go about trying to do something about that. Obviously, the government is trying to create some legislation that maybe they hope will help, but I doubt that it will. And you know, the social media companies now are trying to instigate measures that will help, and who knows really what that will do, but we'll see. In terms of the distraction thing, I think there is sort of a case for this distraction thing. But I think often probably politicians would like to think they can distract the public more than they actually do. And I think they probably can distract the public when it comes to, you know, lots of relatively day-to-day normal policy. But I think the public does pay attention and cares when things happen that actually matter to them. You know, I think if the government is going to make it so that it's going to cost you thousands of pounds to get rid of your boiler and get an electric heating system or whatever, people are going to care about it. I think if the government shortchanges people on rail building in the north or whatever, people are going to care about it. I think on the things that do matter, people will take notice, and people are interested in policy, I think, but I think that it just has to affect them in a very direct way, and then people do care. And then, yeah, how do culture wars end was one of the, yeah, I don't think they probably will, but you know, hopefully we can be a bit more moderate about it, but we're always going to disagree about stuff, and especially cultural stuff, which is not, you know, sort of nice as well in a sense, right? Like, it's good to have things we disagree about. Just we don't have to be unpleasant to each other about it. There you go. That could be our motto for the evening. We can disagree.
Nice.
We don't have to be unpleasant. Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Hello. Oh God, where to start? So many things I want to add. Okay, I'm a democratic socialist, green feminist who also, for democratic, green, socialist reasons, voted Brexit. Also, I'm a woman, a mother who breastfed her children. I'm not a person who just fed. So when I, for example, I've written some things that the Independent have printed on Voices. I just wonder if I announce that, and I want to say fascists, will the fascists cancel me so that I can't write my opinions in the Independent, or on comment is free in the Guardian? So what do you think about that?
I think you're right to worry about that, which is a disturbing reality. I mean, even when you start to say, oh, we're into like motherhood, breastfeeding, you know, I can feel, oh God, you know, that can lead very, very quickly to some very nasty types of conversations. So I right. Yeah. So, I mean, when I've written, people have, a lot of strong reactions. So I think the fact that you're right to worry about that is concerning. Yeah. And I think you're right to worry. Yeah. I'm not saying it's good that you have to worry, but it's right that there is an issue here.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. We've gone 1 minute over. I nearly made it on time, but we're only 1 minute over. Well, so that's it from us. I think, Grant, is there anything else? Nope, all done. So all I've got to do is say thank you all for coming. Thank you, Gideon, for setting some context, and thank you, Zoe and Emilio, for brilliant contributions. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thanks.